Hello. Thank you for joining me once again. I am reading The Children of the Law of One and the Lost Teachings of Atlantis by Jon Peniel. We are on chapter 7 today, page 73. I would like to thank you once again for taking the time to listen to me read. For those of you who would prefer to get the book, I would encourage you to get this book. This book is amazing, so much so to where I feel that is the reason why I need to read it, so that I am doing my part in putting this information out there, because I feel it is really that good and that important. It has spiritual teachings involving consciousness, subconsciousness. It has meditation techniques as well as energy techniques. So get the book yourself or sit back and enjoy me reading to you. Okay? Here we go, chapter 7. The History of the Children of the Law of One, from the beginning to 2001. Why the history? I was never fond of history in school. Thinking back on it, though, it was partly because it was both written and presented in a boring way. But that wasn't all. Specific dates of events were focused on far more than the story of the events. Furthermore, the portrayal of events often had either important omissions or additions that were outright lies or colored to fit someone's program of what they wanted us to learn and believe. There's an old saying about he who wins the war writes the history, and that's not the half of it. My religious training as a child was fraught with similar problems, and I could not get what I considered to be straight, valid, or logical answers to my many questions. But I'd finally found a source of unadulterated history, and one far more interesting and far-reaching than any other. And it included both the secular history of the world and the religious history of multiple religions. But regarding some aspects of history, I still had a bit of block left over from my school days. There was obviously a valid point to learning real history of any kind, at least in the sense of one who doesn't learn from the past is condemned to repeat it. And I had always longed for the history. I was finally going to get a chance to learn. But nevertheless, at the time, I still had the rebellious school kid nagging me in the back of my mind somewhere because of my bad programming, saying, "What's the point? After all, be here now," had been my motto for a while. Even though it seemed ridiculous, I asked Zayn what I had never had the nerve to say to my high school teachers. Only this time it was regarding the history of the children from the time of creation. What's the point? Here was his reply. To know the way of the One, how the universe is, how it works, the immutable laws behind its existence and functioning, has always been fundamental to the children of the Law of One, knowledge and teachings. Even now, this knowledge can be helpful to those who seek to return to the One, to universal consciousness, to a way of living in harmony with the flow of the universe. To these ends, one should understand how the world as we know it became this way, to know the way it all began. Why? Backtracking. Like hikers who have lost their way, if they can determine how they got where they are and where they came from, they can find their way back. If they had a map, so much better. Thus, the better we understand how we lost our spiritual existence, separated from oneness, and became trapped in the earth, the better our knowledge can help us to get free from our traps and return to our spiritual source. For your journey now, we offer you a map of sorts. This map is a story and a history. Written below is the Children of the Law of One's account of creation and the early days of life on Earth. This same story has been passed on by our spiritual ancestors throughout time, since our beginnings on Earth. The adepts who transferred it to their students, who became adepts, who transferred it to their students, who became adepts, etc., etc., have created a chain through history, a lineage of knowledge, connecting us directly to our universal source. I give this to you here, as it was given to me, as it was given to my personal teacher before me, and to his before him. I now pass it on to you, an open link to your potential chain. Prehistory. I have edited the following story somewhat, adapting some modern English terminology and structure, just for ease of understanding. But the teaching is fully intact and very close to the original translation. Even so, you will not be able to truly or completely realize the meaning of our history and the separation from oneness until you are free from your earthly bonds and the limitations of your own brain and consciousness. But what can you do other than work with what you've got? Enjoy. Know yourself, know your true self, and you will know the true story. Know your whole self, and you will know the wholeness of the truth. All is one. There is no other. Thus it always was, and thus it always shall remain. We once experienced only oneness, one being with no division or separate parts. There was no time, no space, nothing other than the us. When you are only one, there is only you, nothing else to interact with. In order to experience interaction, to experience being with someone else, to experience play, the one divided within itself, duplicating the one, thus creating many ones, many beings within the one. Part of this was modern science called the Big Bang. Still being one, now in many parts were we, capable of pretending to be other than one, while still being one in harmonious consciousness. By vibration was it done, division, multiplication, and expansion of the one. Set into motion were vibrations throughout the universe. On it went, dividing, multiplying, creating new aspects of vibration through the overtones of harmony and ripples of the interacting vibratory reflections. Created this many new things and also initiated the time and space. Each of us were the entity of the one, the entirety of the one. The dark, the light, the stars, the planets. All of us macroisms of the one. In clusters, groups, we were in all directions. We being the entire universe. We then roamed ourselves as consciousness, as beings that cannot be described or understood by the present earth consciousness. Yet, describe I will try as best I can. Our existence was, as close as you can comprehend in your present consciousness, as beings of spirit, energy, light, star groups, solar systems, the groups that would be the foundations of a vibratory frequency in creating the physical plane of matter, the appearances there, and that which forms the body of that plane. Unattached, ever flowing with the flows of the universal, one were we, enjoying all the wonders of our new creation. Our consciousness, both semi-separate from, yet still one with, the entire creation of the universe, allowed us the experiencing of new and different things. But within this new creation were the material planes. These were the realms in which existed the most dense or slowest spectrum of vibrations. There were many material planes throughout the universe, the earth being just one. The story I'm about to tell is only of those who manifested in the realms of earth, but others of us manifested in the material planes of other solar systems. Some are now of higher consciousness, kindred beings are they from other worlds. But some from other worlds are of the selfish and evil. When we came upon the world of the earth, we had no comparison, no experience of the like, no expectations of what would be. The first group of us to discover this material plane were in awe of the new sensations it offered. The first group, or first wave of souls to materialize, was the first to enter the vibratorial spectrum of matter in the time space of the earth. They experienced such pleasure from playing in it that they projected themselves deeply into matter in thought forms. Editor's note, using thought to create a body that were the most stimulating, the most sensational. Those of the animal realm creations. In creating the bodies, assorted aspects of different animals were often combined to achieve what they thought would be very desirable blends. Bird head, human bodies, horse body, human head, goat head, human body, fish tail, human torso, and many, many more variations. Author's note. These would much later become known in Greek and Roman mythology by many names: centaurs, minotaurs, mermaids, etc. Unfortunately, these ones, our close kindred, had no way of knowing that as soon as they hardened their thought forms into matter, becoming these creatures, that they would lose all awareness, all consciousness of the most things beyond their new bodies and their immediate environment. They became trapped in these forms. The 7 ports, chakras, were closed, cutting off their contact of full vibrational spectrum, and thus all their perceptions and interactions were thus based only on the limited vibrations they could detect through their 5 vibrational sensors. The 5 senses could only monitor very limited frequency bands of the full universal vibratorial spectrum. And even in that, they focused on only those vibrations relevant to the material planes of existence, leaving these humanimals without any sense of the spiritual planes of existence. Cut off from consciousness of the One, and thus the very universe itself, the humanimals experienced animal consciousness, but the beings inhabiting these forms were not animals and originally of angelic consciousness. The combinations of consciousness that was meant to be of a higher form blended with animal consciousness was a very inharmonious and disruptive mix. They lost the purity of animal consciousness and the purity of spiritual consciousness. So this was a new kind of consciousness that was foreign to the animal realm. This new consciousness was separate consciousness and was of a mixed focus nature and reverse polarity in comparison to the consciousness of the One. Intelligence was also severely curtailed in the humanimal being, similar to the intelligence of the types of animal that they were modeled upon. But again, this was adversely afflicted by the negative effects of separate consciousness. Thus were the animals stuck in this limited plane, in the limited forms, with limited intelligence, in a new limited consciousness. They didn't fit in anywhere. They didn't belong in the spiritual realm any longer, nor did they belong in Earth's nature. Thus, their introduction into the Earth's plane was also disruptive and polluting in the flow of nature. Those of us who did not project ourselves into matter were quite aware of the predicament and fate that had befallen our kin. From the vantage point of our natural etheric state of existence, we were still of one mind, one being. Seeing part of us in such matter-bound prison as humanimals had become trapped was very painful. After all, the creatures were us, were our sister brothers, and their misfortune was our misfortune. In the terminology of some, that might also be called the first fallen angels, but they fell not of ill intent, but of virtue of ignorance of the purest kind. We decided to save them no matter what the cost. We knew we could only do this if we could function on the same vibratory plane as they, so we too projected ourselves into thought form that could function within the realms of the Earth Mother. Led by the great being who became known as Atlantean Omelios, then later as Thoth, and eventually well known as Jesus, much later. The second wave of our entering into the Earth's plane of the Earth Mother began. Carefully to stay as beings free from the lower vibratory planes or hardening into the matter, we projected ourselves into the material plane with thought form bodies that were semi-etheric matter, but not matter. Thus, were we still able to function on all vibrational frequencies of the universal spectrum, free to enter or leave the limited spectrum of the material plane at will. But most importantly, we were very intent upon maintaining our consciousness of oneness. so that we would not fall into the same fate as the humanimals. The manifestation was achieved more or less successfully, and as we became subject to the vibratory conditions which affected this realm, we saw numerological representations which the physical plane of the physical plane 2 and 5 appeared in many aspects of our manifestation. For example, the beginnings of the 5 races occurred, and later the 2 sexes, each being having 5 appendages: 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head, with 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 legs, 2 of many organs, etc., and 5 fingers, toes on the arms and legs. Despite our precautions and great efforts, some of us still fared not as well as others, losing more consciousness and hardening more than others. Those who manifested in Atlantis with Amelios fared the best, but for many, this was to be short-lived. Until this time, we were composite beings, macrocosms of the One. Our bodies were not as they are now. Our male and female elements had not yet separated. As composite beings, we each had one body that contained both sexes, rather than the male and female bodies we have now. The sexes then being just the inner and outer elements and outflowing and inflowing parts of our whole being. These were soulmate groups, as they are called now. Each composite being had different number of parts, a different number of soulmates, each part a being itself, but fully as one with the whole being. We were like beings in which planets orbit a star, or the atoms of matter, in which elements of different polarity, male and female, are attracted to each other, each finding a place where they harmoniously function together within the whole, as one entity, one being. As such composite beings, we existed in a state of unselfish love, constant flow, outflowing, giving fully of our life energies to each element of ourselves, within ourselves, and receiving within ourselves, and without in our relationship with the One, which each composite being also orbited, creating the even greater ultimate composite being of the One. Now, for the first time, some of us had begun to separate within ourselves, manifesting as individual bodies, representing the polarity elements. Bodies of opposite polarities then came into existence, male or female sex. The work of freeing the humanimals began. It was arduous and complex, but proceeded well at first. Unfortunately, the contamination of separateness slowly began to creep in. We started slowly tasting many of the things that had instantly trapped the humanimals. Division began to occur between Atlanteans over opinions and desires. The next symptom of our disintegration was upon us, and this disease would eventually bring down Atlantis. Even in this higher state of manifestation, which we thought would keep us safe from the loss of consciousness that plagued the humanimals. Some of us succumb to the lure of material sensation. Like the drug addict would have with an unlimited supply of drugs, we began to delve more into the indulgence of this plane until we were lost in it, drowning in it. In the frenzy of our addiction to the physical sensations, we disregarded all our precautions and wariness. Soon our thoughts and actions had collected matter from this material world that surrounded us and hardened our thought forms, making us matter bound also. Our consciousness simultaneously slipped, and our gradual loss of consciousness of oneness gave way to that new consciousness of predominant separateness. The consciousness of predominant separateness was foreign to us, a totally new experience. And along with this new consciousness came new emotion, some pleasurable, some painful. Strange new things like greed, envy, lust, excitement, fear, and desire. Some of us rigorously strive to maintain a new semblance of our consciousness of oneness, along with the new consciousness, and we were able to experience the emotion without being ruled by them. Such were the children of the law of one. But others lost or chose to deliberately suppress even a glimmer of awareness of the one. These beings became lost and enmeshed in separateness. Outside of the consciousness of oneness, they became subject to being tossed to and fro by the tides of emotional onslaught, and ultimately became devoted to personal power and pleasure in this physical plane. These beings became known as the sons of Belial, even if they were female. Take heed of the ancient warnings and prophecies about the Belialians. Lizard-like they are, not in apparent physical description, but in spirit form, in the heart, in the soul. Beware, even now, of your lizard kin, for they rule the world with greed, without compassion, while maintaining appearance of good and righteous. As men and women do these sons of Belial walk the earth. Model citizens, successful leaders who are the envy of the uninitiated. While some appear disgusting and strange to the eye, look not to see the ugliness of the Belialians with your eye, for some are handsome to the eye. See, you will, not their true lizard-like appearance with your earthly eyes. See their true nature, you will only with the inner eye, or in glimpse from the corner of the eye. When this division came within the people of Atlantis, many things went awry, and turmoil began. To function harmoniously, beings need to have omnipresence. Their vision must include the whole picture. But when the attention is fixed and focused in the reverse polarity of separation, All that is seen are parts of the whole picture. Those parts that are not filtered out by the illusions of separate consciousness. It is a limited view at best, and often is a lens distorted by emotions. Without awareness of the whole picture and the guidance of a coordinating force, actions become uncoordinated with others. To understand this better, imagine how well your present day body would function if each limb did not have awareness of what the other limbs were trying to do, or if each limb wanted to do different things from each other, no longer working together as one. Now imagine further. Imagine this lack of coordination keeping your eyes, ears, fingers, tongue, and mouth from working together as a team. Now consider the chaos and eventually destruction that would occur if every single cell in your body operated with no unified guiding force that keeps them coordinated with the whole. In fact, that is what cancer is. You see, this became the problem with our very lives once some of us lost consciousness of the one. Some uncoordinated independent activity became a logical evolution when such a separation occurs and one is left with only an awareness of separateness. Thus, it came to be that the new Atlantean socio-political groups evolved with one very essential difference. The children had a consciousness of both separateness and oneness. The Belialians rejected the consciousness of one entirely and maintained only a consciousness of separateness. The difference of opinion between the two groups were great and many, including environmental issues. But nothing was more of an issue than the morality of how the humanimals were to be dealt with. Those of the law of one, remembering still that we originally came to this plane just to help release the humanimals from matter bondage, continued trying to free our trapped siblings. The kindred also created ways known to the initiate to aid in the maintenance of the consciousness of oneness, so we would never lose sight of our goals. But the Belialians wanted to use the humanimals for their own comforts and pleasures. Since those of us from the second wave were of greater consciousness than the humanimals and could still function on higher planes to some extent, we had powers of the mind, both spiritual and psychological, that made it easy for us to control humanimals. The children refused to use their abilities to control the humanimals, while the Belialians relished the powers and wanted to use them as slaves. The other great division in opinion between the children and the Belialians was over the environment, as it is called now. The Belialians used methods of generating power, like electrical power, that were dangerous and destructive to the earth. Thus did the great conflict between the children and the Belialians of Atlantis begin. A conflict between light and dark, between selfishness and unselfish love. And the conflict that was continued throughout history and continues to this day. The Belialians' lust for power and lack of care or awareness of the balance of nature led to the destruction of Atlantis. This was due in great part to the abuse of their power-generating plants. When the final destruction occurred, Grandmaster Thought then led us to the land of Khem, Khem, to complete the great work of evolving the humanimals. As gods we were to the people of Khem, and yea, did they think the humanimals to be gods. And so it was done. The humanimals were brought to human levels to choose their path from there. Yet there are the residual effects. Have you not seen the humans that look much like pigs or goats or this or that animal still? These were they. But even though the humanimals were no more, the Belialians had lost their taste. But even though the humanimals were no more, the Belialians had not lost their taste for slavery. Thus the great conflict with the Belialians was far from over and still continues on with the children of the Law of One as lamps illuminating the path of unselfish love, helping the lost find their way home to their spiritual heritage of the One and to find freedom, while the disguised sons of Belial and their pawns do everything possible to maintain their decadence and power and maintain slavery, whether it be directed or by means of livelihood and social control. And they seek to destroy all those who would shine light into this world of darkness. All those who do not actively work for the light are, to varying degrees, pawns of the Belialian darkness. Okay, I'm going to stop there for now because this is going to be a long read, and that was the prehistory. And when I continue, we'll continue on page 81. Okay? Thank you for joining me once again, for listening to The Children of the Law of One and the Lost Teachings of Atlantis by Jon Peniel. I highly recommend this book, and I highly recommend for you to pick it up, read it, reread it, decide for yourself. Okay? Until then, thank you once again for joining me.